Caitlin Clark, Kelsey Mitchell, and the fever problem nobody can ignore. If one loss can expose everything a team has been trying to hide, then this night in Dallas may have just told us the real story of the Indiana Fever. Stay with me, because what looked like a simple 91-85 loss might actually be the game that forced everybody to stop pretending, stop spinning, and start asking the hardest question in Indiana right now. What exactly is this team trying to become? And before we go any further, subscribe right now, because if you care about Caitlin Clark, the Fever, and the power struggle that could shape the future of this franchise, you do not want to miss what comes next, because the biggest takeaway from this game was not even the final score. Coming into this matchup, the Fever had momentum, belief, and a chance to keep building on a stretch that made people think this team was finally turning a corner. But then Dallas happened, and yes, the scoreboard says the Wings won 91-85. Yes, the box score says Kelsey Mitchell was brilliant with 37 points. Yes, Caitlin Clark had 10 points and 9 assists. On the surface, that sounds like a tough night, maybe even just one of those games every contender has to survive. But if you watched closely, you know the conversation does not stop at numbers. It starts there. Because this was not just about missing shots. It was not just about one player getting hot and another player having an off night. It was about rhythm, identity, hierarchy, late-game trust, and the feeling that this team still has not fully answered the question of whose game is supposed to define their future. And that is where things get interesting. Let's start with what nobody can deny. Kelsey Mitchell was sensational. 37 points. 15 made free throws, a historic milestone with 21 straight games scoring at least 20 points. That is not opinion. That is elite production. That is a player who showed up and carried a massive scoring load when the Fever needed offense. So this is not a hit piece on Kelsey Mitchell. It cannot be, because the facts do not support that. She was one of the biggest reasons Indiana even had a chance to stay in the fight. If we are going to be fair, we have to say that first. But fairness also means saying the next part. A great scoring night for Mitchell does not automatically erase the bigger question about team balance. Because when one player is rolling and another star is drifting, the real issue is not who played harder or who wanted it more. The real issue is whether the offense is creating the kind of environment where your most important pieces can threaten the game together. That is the part people keep arguing about, and that is the part this Dallas game threw right into everybody's face. Caitlin Clark finished with 10 points and 9 assists. For most guards, that sounds respectable. For Caitlin Clark, that stat line tells a more complicated story. It tells you she was involved, but not fully in command. It tells you she created, but never truly took over. It tells you she was on the floor, but not at the center of the storm the way people expect when she is at her best. And when Caitlin Clark is not dictating the emotional temperature of a game, fans start looking for answers. Was it Dallas's defense? Partly yes. Was it a rough shooting night? Absolutely. ESPN's recap noted that both Clark and Paige Buchers had poor shooting nights, combining to go 9 for 31 from the field. So let's be honest about that. Not every frustrating Clark game is proof of a conspiracy. Sometimes stars miss shots. Sometimes the defense does its job. Sometimes the game gets ugly. Basketball is still basketball, but if you stop there, you miss the real tension. Because what fans are reacting to is not just Clark's shooting percentage. They are reacting to the feeling that Indiana still looks torn between two basketball identities. One identity says this should be a pace and space attack driven by Clark's vision, range, tempo, and gravity. The other identity leans toward a more traditional structure where possessions settle, half-court actions tighten, and the game flows through multiple established scorers instead of one singular engine. Neither approach is automatically wrong. The problem is what happens when a team seems trapped between them. That is when possessions start to feel disconnected. That is when one player looks hot while another looks strangely distant. That is when fans stop debating talent and start debating fit. And that is exactly why this loss landed harder than an ordinary loss should. Because the Fever are too talented for this conversation to still be so messy. You have Caitlin Clark, one of the biggest forces the sport has seen in years, a player whose deep shooting and passing vision bend defenses the moment she crosses half court. You have Kelsey Mitchell, a proven scorer who can explode at any time and just set a league record with her latest scoring streak. You have Aliyah Boston, a foundational front-court player the Fever have already committed to long-term, reportedly on a 4-year, $6.3 million extension. This is not some roster waiting for its first building block. The building blocks are already there. So if the talent is real, why does a game like this still produce so many uncomfortable questions? Here is why. Because the modern sports audience does not just watch results anymore. They watch interactions. They watch body language. They watch who gets the ball in big moments. They watch who initiates the offense. They watch who looks empowered and who looks reduced to reacting. And when the franchise's most visible star seems unable to put her fingerprints all over a critical game, the noise gets louder instantly. That noise is even louder with Caitlin Clark because nobody covers her like a normal player. Every possession becomes a debate. Every facial expression becomes a theory. Every loss becomes a referendum on the entire organization. That is the price of stardom. And that is also why Indiana cannot afford confusion. Because confusion around ordinary players fades. Confusion around Caitlin Clark becomes a national storyline. And if you think that sounds dramatic, just look at what one loss did. Suddenly, people were not simply discussing the Wings game. They were discussing coaching, roles, trust, tension, long-term team construction. That does not happen unless the fan base already believes there is something unresolved underneath the surface. Now let's talk about the most dangerous thing a team can face when expectations are high, a loss that confirms what critics were already waiting to say. Critics of Indiana will say this game proved the Fever still do not have a fully coherent offensive identity. They will say a franchise built around Clark should never have so many possessions where she feels like one option among many instead of the force that shapes everything. They will say great teams do not make their stars look ordinary in games that matter. They will say the offense still oscillates between brilliant and clunky, because it has not fully committed to the most devastating version of itself. Supporters of the current setup will answer that basketball is not a one-player movie. They will point to Mitchell's 37. They will remind everyone that Clark still had 9 assists. They will say defenses are loading up on her, forcing others to eat. And on many nights, that is exactly what winning basketball should look like. They will argue that balance, not worship, is what turns hype into playoff survival. And here is the truth. Both sides have a point. That is what makes this so fascinating. Yes, Caitlin Clark should not have to take every shot, dominate every possession, or function as the only answer. But yes, the Fever also need to build a game environment where her strengths remain the center of gravity, not an accessory that appears in flashes. That distinction matters more than ever. Because when Clark is fully engaged, she does not just score, she creates panic. Defenders extend farther than they want. Help rotations get distorted, passing lanes open half a beat earlier, the floor feels wider, teammates get cleaner looks because the defense is terrified of what might happen if she gets comfortable. Even on nights when she's not scoring 30, her presence is supposed to distort the geometry of the game. And on this night, too often, Indiana looked like a team fighting the game instead of controlling its geometry. Now let's be careful here, because this is where online narratives get reckless. There is a big difference between saying a team looked disjointed and saying there was sabotage. There is a big difference between saying fans noticed frustration and saying there is a confirmed internal war. There is a big difference between saying the offense looked off and inventing stories about players refusing to cooperate. That is why this rewrite matters. No credible reporting I found confirmed a deliberate plot to freeze Clark out. No credible reporting I found confirmed an actual Clark and Cunningham plan to leave Indiana for New York. No credible reporting I found confirmed that this was anything more than a frustrating loss mixed with a rough offensive night and a huge individual game from Mitchell. So if we are going to tell this story the right way, we tell it as a pressure story, not a fantasy story. And pressure is real. Pressure is what happens when a team with three major names still doesn't feel settled. Pressure is what happens when one star has a historic scoring streak and the other star becomes the center of every emotional reaction online. Pressure is what happens when a nationally watched franchise loses to a team that had been struggling and suddenly every unresolved issue gets dragged into daylight. That is the real drama here. And it gets even bigger when you realize this game may have said as much about the Fever's ceiling as it did about their flaws, because championship-level teams can survive an off-shooting night. They can survive one player getting trapped. They can survive a hot opponent. What separates real contenders from exciting teams is whether they can still look structurally sound when things get uncomfortable. Dallas looked connected enough to close. Indiana looked dangerous, but unsettled. That should worry people. Arike Ogunbowale scored 32. Jessica Shepard added 26. Awak Kuier gave Dallas 11 points, 8 rebounds, and a career-high 7 blocks. That is not a fluke script. That is a team getting punched by multiple sources and not answering cleanly enough. And this is where the next layer of suspense kicks in, because the Fever are running out of room for "they'll figure it out" to be the only response. At some point, great talent has to become repeatable control. At some point, people stop asking whether the stars can coexist and start asking whether the current formula maximizes either one. At some point, the front office, the coaching staff, the players, and the fan base all realize they are not arguing about one loss anymore. They are arguing about which version of Indiana is actually supposed to win in the biggest moments. Think about that carefully. If Mitchell is scorching hot, the Fever can look explosive. If Clark is orchestrating everything, the Fever can look electric. If Boston is anchoring both ends, the Fever can look complete. But what does Indiana look like when all of those truths are supposed to exist at the same time? That is the mystery. That is why this conversation is not going away. And that is why every game from this point forward feels like evidence. Fans will watch early possessions and ask, who is initiating? They will watch after timeouts and ask, what action are they prioritizing? They will watch crunch time and ask, who is trusted to create the final advantage? They will watch body language and ask, does this look like belief or irritation? They will watch the spacing and ask, does this offense breathe or does it stall? That is what this Dallas loss activated. It turned the microscope all the way up. Now let's talk specifically about Clark, because this is where the story always turns. A 10-point, 9-assist night can be interpreted in two completely different ways. One reading says she was unselfish, still creating, still trying to make the game work even without her shot. Another reading says she was never allowed to fully become the central force the team needs her to be. The fascinating thing is that both readings can be true in the same game. That is what makes star-led basketball so hard to evaluate, because the box score shows involvement. The eye test asks whether the involvement had enough authority. And when you are Caitlin Clark, authority is the whole point. Nobody fears her because she merely participates. Teams fear her because she can take over the architecture of a game. When that power shows up only in fragments, the Fever become easier to live with. And if you are an Indiana fan, that sentence should hit hard, because the goal is not just to have a famous roster. The goal is to become a team opponents dread for 40 minutes. That means the next step for Indiana is not emotional, it is structural. How do they create more seamless offense between Clark and Mitchell? How do they prevent hot scoring from turning into one-dimensional flow? How do they make Boston a pressure point instead of a release valve? How do they make role players feel engaged before the fourth quarter? How do they make late-game execution look inevitable instead of improvised? Those are championship questions. And right now, the Fever are still living inside them. Another thing that has to be said: the internet loves absolute villains and heroes. It wants one person to blame and one person to rescue everything. But real basketball rarely works that way. Not every rough possession is selfishness. Not every coaching choice is disrespect. Not every tense moment is a feud. Sometimes a talented team is simply still in the painful stage where talent has outpaced clarity. That may be the best description of Indiana right now. Talented enough to scare people. Important enough to dominate headlines. Not yet clear enough to silence the arguments. And that is why this next stretch matters so much. Because if the Fever respond by tightening their identity, this Dallas loss becomes a turning point in the best possible sense. It becomes the game that forced them to see themselves honestly. It becomes the film session that led to better balance. It becomes the moment where roles sharpened, trust improved, and the offense stopped feeling like it had to choose between stars. But if they do not respond, this same loss becomes something darker. It becomes proof that the concerns were real. It becomes the game people point back to and say, that was when the cracks stopped being invisible. It becomes the night where winning the headline battle started to matter more than winning the identity battle. And that is where the suspense sits. What happens next? Does Clark come out in the next big game looking fully unleashed, aggressive, and impossible to contain? Does Mitchell keep the scoring streak alive while the team finds a healthier offensive blend? Does Boston reassert herself as the interior stabilizer that makes everything cleaner? Does the coaching staff adjust in ways that make the whole thing look more synchronized? Or does the same conversation keep returning after every awkward loss? That is the question hanging over this team now. And make no mistake, the stakes are not small. Because this franchise is not operating in obscurity anymore. Every decision is magnified. Every win is celebrated nationally. Every loss turns into debate content. Every sign of frustration gets replayed from 5 different angles. That is what happens when a team becomes one of the central stories in the sport. Indiana asked for relevance. Now relevance is demanding answers. I also want to address one more thing that often gets exaggerated in clips and reaction videos. The idea that if Clark is not scoring huge, then she is automatically being failed. That is too simplistic. Great players can have quiet scoring nights for lots of reasons. The standard should not be, Clark must always score 30. The standard should be, does the team consistently put its stars in positions where their best skills can reshape the game? That is the better test. And against Dallas, Indiana did not pass that test convincingly enough, not because Mitchell was too good, not because Clark was terrible, not because Boston does not matter, but because the whole thing still looked like it was searching for the cleanest version of itself. That is a deeper problem than one cold shooting night. And here is the scary part for the rest of the league. If Indiana ever truly solves that equation, they become terrifying. If Clark's tempo becomes the organizing principle, if Mitchell's shot-making becomes the punishment for overhelp, if Boston becomes the stabilizing interior force that turns pressure into easy baskets, if the role players start getting rhythm looks instead of bailout touches, then the Fever stop being a fascinating project and become a machine. That is what makes this so important. The gap between what Indiana is and what Indiana could be is still wide enough to keep everyone arguing. And maybe that is why this loss hit such a nerve, because it reminded people that potential can be exciting for only so long. Eventually, potential has to choose a shape. So here is the honest verdict. This was not a sabotage game. This was not proof of a confirmed locker room civil war. This was not evidence of a real New York escape plan. This was not a reason to throw out every player except one. What it was a revealing game. A revealing game about role tension. A revealing game about offensive identity. A revealing game about how much attention follows Clark into every possession. A revealing game about how historic scoring from Mitchell can still leave bigger questions unanswered. A revealing game about why a talented roster can still feel emotionally fragile under the spotlight. And if you are the Fever, that should concern you just enough to force change, but not enough to create panic. Because the worst mistake a team like this can make is confusing discomfort with doom. Discomfort can teach you. Doom just paralyzes you. Indiana still has too much talent for doom talk, but they also have too much talent to keep excusing avoidable confusion. That is the balance they have to find. As for Caitlin Clark, the bigger point is this. Her future does not need fake drama to feel significant. The real story is already big enough. She is the face of a team trying to turn hype into authority. She is playing under a microscope few athletes ever experience. She is trying to win while being turned into a nightly referendum. And every time the Fever fail to look fully connected, the pressure on her grows, even if the box score does not capture all of it. That is real. That is enough. No fabricated rumor is needed, and Kelsey Mitchell deserves her truth too. Her 37-point night was not the problem. It was one of the few reasons Indiana stayed alive. If anything, her performance proved again that the Fever have another major weapon. The challenge is not reducing Mitchell. The challenge is integrating Mitchell's brilliance into a structure that still feels unmistakably organized around the team's biggest long-term advantage. That is a much smarter conversation than blaming one player for everything. Same with Aliyah Boston. If you are going to mention her contract, mention it accurately. The reporting says 4 years, $6.3 million total, with an average annual salary of $1.575 million. That matters because credibility matters. If you want your audience to trust the rest of the story, the details have to be right. And that brings us to the final layer of this whole situation. The most interesting thing about the Fever right now is not that they lost. It is that every loss reveals what fans fear most. That the talent is obvious, that the star power is obvious, that the relevance is obvious. But the final formula still is not. Maybe they solve it quickly. Maybe this game becomes the wake-up call. Maybe the next time Clark, Mitchell, and Boston share the floor in a tense matchup, it all clicks with the kind of clarity that ends this debate in one night. Or maybe it does not. Maybe the same questions return. Maybe the same split-screen conversation keeps following them. Maybe every national game becomes another audition for the version of Indiana that is supposed to last. That is why you cannot look away. Because this is no longer just about one box score in Dallas. This is about the blueprint of a franchise. This is about whether one of the most watched teams in basketball can align talent, vision, and trust before the pressure gets louder than the progress. And this is about whether Caitlin Clark's era in Indiana becomes a model of smart team building or a case study in how hard it is to organize greatness when everybody wants the ball, the spotlight, and the final word. So yes, Dallas won the game. Yes, Mitchell made history. Yes, Clark had an off-shooting night. Yes, the Fever have enough talent to fix this. But the real story is still waiting. The real story is what Indiana looks like in the next pressure game. The real story is whether they emerge more unified or more questioned. The real story is whether this loss was a warning they used or a warning they wasted.